the most important issue in responsible tourism over the next 5 years? It's carbon. This is the smallest attendance we've had at anything for years. And I think what that shows is just how big the battle is going to be to get the travel and tourism industry to address carbon. People are in part in denial, in part just frightened of it and not wanting to think about it, hoping it won't happen. And in a way, I think every report that comes out and says we'll all be dead in 100 years just makes it more difficult to get people to act. We've got to have a serious rethink, I think, about how we communicate the importance of carbon. So we have a small but extremely high quality and committed audience. So I'm hoping that we have got some great presentations, but I'm hoping we'll also have time for some discussion. So I've asked the speakers to be quite sharp about what they say and hopefully quite provocative so that we get the best out of this. But I think the thing we all need to focus on is how we increase the number of people in here by about 500%. And that's quite a big challenge. I've seen some of the presentations, I haven't seen all of them, but they are quite interesting examples of what can seriously be done. So without further ado, I'm going to show you Chobe's presentation. Unfortunately, there's nobody here from Chobe, but they made a video specially to contribute. So we will have the first presentation will be a video from Chobe, who have just won an award, WTM Responsible Tourism Award. we can discuss later maybe how good this is, but one of the fundamental problems is that putting up 56,000 kilograms of carbon may mean something to a scientist, but it means very little. That conceptualizing how much carbon has been emitted or saved is still a challenge, despite 2 major Hollywood budget movies having been made. We still don't have any easy way of visualizing what a kilogram of carbon dioxide looks like. And I think that is one of our challenges, because if that was litter and you had a pile of it, it would be easy to see, but the carbon is not possible to see. And the other problem, I think, is that the world appears to have, when you look up into the night sky, you think there's an infinite atmosphere. Very few people realize just how narrow the atmosphere is before it goes to space. Somehow we need a graphic that shows just how much of that breathable air is now polluted carbon dioxide. We've got to really work on this because we're failing to make the message. Sorry, I'm not supposed to be making a presentation, am I? Can we have a complete change now of focus? Lucien, would you like to come and do your presentation next? I've seen this one. I think it's an extremely fine presentation.
So thank you very much for giving the opportunity to maybe show you a little bit how we deal with the carbon topic in our company. I have to just see. Okay. I will first give you, because I don't know who knows us. Perfect. Tui Cruises is a German cruise company, having 6 ships now worldwide in service. A German product, German speaking. So mostly you might not know of the product because it's not really present in the British market, but we also belong to the Tui group partly, so that's maybe a connection you can work with. I was asked to show how a cruise company is actually dealing with the carbon emission topics, how we report that, and also how we do communicate or try to communicate what we are doing and what kind of progresses we do over the last years and in the future. So give me a short overview on the cruise industry and greenhouse gas emissions, just to have the framework right, because I think there are a lot of different information out there when we talk about the cruise industry. The global cruise industry, and I'm only speaking about the high sea cruising, no river boats or ferries, really the passenger high sea cruising. That is a fleet of approximately 300 ships with a growing tendency. You might have heard that there's a lot of new builds coming in the next couple of years. The international shipping, so the whole commercial fleet with all the container ships bringing your clothes from China to Europe or whatever it's produced there, commercial shipping, that's about, or it's responsible for about like 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The cruise industry represents less than 4% of the international shipping fleet. So you see it's a really marginal part of the shipping course greenhouse gas emission. Nevertheless, there's a lot of regulation in place actually to tackle the greenhouse gas or the carbon topic in the shipping industry. I don't want to bore you with a lot of rules and regulations, but let me just focus on 2 important conventions. So the first one is the organization that are regulating carbon emissions in the future. First is the IMO, it's the International Maritime Organization. That is actually the international body giving out the international regulations for shipping, not only for environmental topics, also for safety, for everything. And there we have the MARPOL Convention, and the Annex 4, Chapter 4, is actually dealing with the energy efficiency. an energy efficiency management plan that has to be implemented on all ships. That is mandatory since quite a few years, and the energy design index, energy efficiency design index, is something for new builds where you have to meet a fixed benchmark when it comes to an energy efficiency value that correlates directly to your carbon emissions. That is the first one. That's the international regulation. That is actually for every ship that is built has to meet these standards. There's also some regional approach that has the EU. The EU doesn't was reluctant to wait for the IMO level to agree on international scheme on monitoring CO2 emissions. That's why the EU was kind of going ahead, and they agreed on a monitoring, verification, and reporting directive that starts actually next January. But in this year, the ship owners had a lot of homework to do to be prepared for the start. And this directive actually is mandatory also for all for all ships coming or going to or calling an EU port from January on. So that's a lot of ships, as you can imagine. A lot of the world's fleet is actually in somehow going to Europe. And the ship owner now is required to monitor their carbon emissions, to let it be the reporting method has to be verified by a third party. That's more like the ship class societies, and then you have to report it to the EU. The idea is that over the next couple of years, the EU is getting a lot of data about the real carbon emissions from the shipping industry. Just don't forget, it's really the whole industry, the whole global industry, to really have a database where they then want to make sophisticated carbon goals then for the coming years. Of course, you can say that that's a long time going, and actually time is running. That's why especially cruise companies didn't wait for this to happen. And that's what I will show you soon. So first of all, let me just introduce a little bit what we as Tui Cruises are doing to reduce our CO2 emissions. I was trying how to explain it, not in so technical terms. I know it's mostly technical stuff here, so if you have any questions afterwards, feel free. On a strategic and management level, we set a long-term goal. I think that's really important for a company to have a vision where you want to stand somewhere down the road with not only carbon emissions, but in a lot of environmental fields. You should be clear about your vision or your direction, where do you want to go, and how strong your ambition is to tackle these kind of impacts. We set a 2025 goal for 40% less CO2 compared to the 2015 baseline. Oh, 5 minutes. We have an energy efficiency and greenhouse gas emission reduction incorporated in our environmental strategy. Our renewables were all meeting the EED benchmark and over-exceeding them. What we did as a first cruise company is that we put in our contracts for the new builds energy efficiency values, so the yard had to meet them, and they were very ambitious, 30% less energy than comparable ships that were built. We also have, like, the ISO standard should be known to some of you. There's the 14,001 for environmental management. We have that also on the ship, but we also have the 14,001 for energy management. On the operational level, when it comes really to get the ships moving, we optimize our routings and speeds. We have a lot of overnights included, because the slower and the shorter you are sailing, the less fuel and the less carbon you are emitting. We have automatic monitoring systems. It's really what you might know from hotel systems, where you have automatic lighting systems, so forth. Also on our headquarters side, we have a sustainable mobility program for our employees, renewable energy for all our headquarters, and we are also engaged in carbon offsetting programs. So how do we report now all the data? How we measure it and how we communicate these efforts. I don't want to go really into the numbers, but that are different dashboards from different systems we have on the ships who are all extracting on a daily, hourly basis all the different numbers we then put together in our KPIs. So it's a very sophisticated system, a lot of data coming in on a daily basis. Also for the MRV directive I already mentioned, we adapted our fleet voyage reporting and we included a lot of factors, distance sailed, fuel types, passenger carried, and so on. So for all voyages from the EU ports, we will have all the data at hand, but Tui Cruises will cover for all their voyages worldwide these kind of data bases. So we will get the number for all cruises we have. How do we communicate that? As Harold was mentioning, absolutely right, it's a very complex topic. So we have a lot of stakeholders sitting in different areas of the world, having different KPIs. That's always for us, having the carbon issue as such is very complex. And now we have 3 different stakeholders, Tui Cruises, Tui Group here in with different KPIs, and also Royal Caribbean as an US corporation. What we try to do for our customers, also for our stakeholders like journalists and politicians, we put together this kind of infographic showing them, okay, how many fuel do we reduce? We put together some, of course you need some graphics, and you try to get some visibility in how much reduction we can achieve, and try to put the exact examples together how we did that. So you really have to connect your carbon reductions with like the exact actions and measures you're doing to reduce that or to achieve that. We have our environmental report. We dedicated a whole emission chapter each and every year for this topic, where we have our KPIs in a number basis, where we try from year to year show our progress. We try to get graphics out there to show, okay, here over the last couple of years, so you can catch the progress very easily. We have the total CO2 emission from the awards. One of the awardees from the Responsible Tourism Award was saying, we are honestly communicating, and I think we have the same philosophy. We are putting out there absolute numbers. We are really telling what worked, what didn't work. When we first published that, our mother company from the US were like, you can't put out there total numbers. That's you can't do that. That's too much transparency. We're like, no, why? It's not, I mean, there's nothing bad about it to communicate where you stand and where you want to go. What we also have is a company website that dedicates the emission part, a whole sub-pages with different under topics. 1 minute to go. Okay, that's my last slide actually. Where our customers, but also our stakeholders can get all the information they need, like numbers, graphics, stories, photographs from our website. It's unfortunately only in German. The environmental report is also in English. And what we recently did is we produced an animated clip, because still with all the information out there from our company in regards of the carbon management and reductions, it was still too abstract for the normal customer itself. So we produced a very easy clip. Our environmental officer, she's explaining how we do it with not a lot of numbers, but with a lot of examples how we do it and where we want to go. And this is actually, I think, a great tool to get people on board, understand what we are doing, what we achieved so far, and where we are going. Thank you.
I told you it would be a good presentation, and it was. Lucien, just before we disappear, and we will come back to questions at the end, I think one of the big challenges, your point about transparency is right, and I was interested to hear what the other company said. One of the problems, and this is true, John, I hope you'll address this, is how do you see how well one company is performing as against another?
Yeah.
Will I live long enough to see this?
Actually, I don't know. I can't make any promises, but that's a valid point. When we started at Tui Cruises, it's a very young company, founded in 2008. The environmental management was then institutionalized 2 years later. And we thought about, okay, what kind of KPIs we are measuring. We looked at all our competitors, and there are so many different KPIs out there. There is no explanation how you measure it, what kind of factors are going in, what passenger, crew, only passenger, or also with crew. And you have so many determinants, and it can vary from company to company. Sometimes it's only a cultural thing. I mean, the US-based companies, they have just different approaches in counting stuff. But with the MRV directive, I think that is a very good step, because when these reports will be published, not on a company-based, but they will have one metric for the shipping emissions, carbon-related, and of course, it's the company itself that then can decide, okay, I do the same reporting in my reports then. And maybe then we get more comparable.
This is more or less similar presentation I gave a day or so ago, so I'm going to kind of rattle through things. This is an example of one of our businesses. It's the Colonial again. It's arguably the greenest in the UK. Good efficiency, good low carbon consumption. We measure carbon in terms of carbon per overnight with our accommodation stock, and they have accommodation. But they have a biomass boiler, and they have a kind of composting system which takes biogas as well. So they've got some really nice green features, and they're one of our lowest carbon businesses. But what's interesting when you look at carbon, and Chobe, who we saw the example there, saving 100 tons of carbon in their business through their vehicle fleet and so on. This is great, but I think we also have to recognise that it's actually the travel that's one of the biggest impact areas, and how people get to Scotland is going to be a really big issue for us in terms of tackling carbon emissions going forward. There's definitely moves to having more people coming more internationally and for shorter periods. And to stay in this accommodation, you would have to spend a year in this accommodation to make up the same emissions as you would do to fly across the Atlantic. So that just gives an example of the kind of carbon figures that we may be working with within the actual hospitality sector, and actually the big issues that relate to people's travel, and we really do need to tackle that. So I'm going to mention more about our actual metrics and our system. If you don't know about green tourism, we have a 3-level certification program. So it's to get people to move forward. It's to keep that progression moving along. That's a picture of our team of assessors. So we go out and visit properties and so on and see how they're going down the green route. We've been doing it for 20 years this year. We're just about to do our 20th anniversary report. We look to TUI to some extent for some of the great infographics they do on their reporting, and we'll look to do something similar in terms of helping to tell that story, and I think that's a really important thing. I mean, it came again, certification and badges and so on are great, but I think people really want to know stories. They want to know a little bit more about what's behind these things, and we need to be able to tell that in a very tangible way. This is some of the figures that we've got based upon our 20th anniversary and part of our submission for the Responsible Tourism Award. Just to pick up on a couple of those things, the bottom ones there, the saving on water, obviously that's one of the key metrics we can measure. We collect figures from our businesses on how much water they consume. And between 2010 and 2015, we've been pushing our businesses to reduce the water consumption in the hotels, and therefore by measuring businesses switching from 12 litres a minute on showers to 8 litres a minute, which is now our new criteria, we've been able to achieve a saving of approximately 700,000 tonnes of water. We're also on track with saving 1 million tonnes of carbon. It's over 2,000 businesses. It's a metric that we use based on carbon per overnight, and that's a figure of the saving achieved since 2008. and it's based upon, like I say, based upon collecting real data. And I think that's a really important thing. There's a lot of talk about carbon. Everybody wants to have an answer, and everyone wants to tell a good story. But there are organisations that, in the hurry to try and tell a good story, will use statistics to try and produce figures rather than actually going down to the raw data. And it's really important we get businesses to as TUI do, to actually use proper real data and be prepared to be honest about it. None of us are perfect, but we all have to use these metrics in the right way. Otherwise, we're really facing a much more dangerous situation where people will, out of their own goodwill, make some of the wrong choices in terms of places they stay and places they visit. These are some of the benchmarks. We started our program in 97, but we didn't get enough data to be able to produce some benchmarks until 2010. Once we got to over 1,000 members, we were able to produce some benchmarks. So we used that, as TUI have been using from 2015. I think you said we got a baseline from 2010. We have a carbon calculator, again, trying to make things simple. We use the hand as a nice, simple graphic to show businesses, even individuals, even in your own home, you could do this. If you know your kilowatt hours of electricity and your consumption of gas, you know the floor area of your building, and you know some figure which relates to your economic performance. So, for example, in a hotel, it's bed nights. In a conference centre, it would be delegates. So that's a useful indicator to see how you're able to grow your business economically, but also reduce your effect on the carbon footprint at the same time. And we also collect data on water consumption. And then we do that because those are the easy figures to be able to get proper metrics on. Obviously, there are things like food miles and all these other aspects to do with carbon, but we measure that qualitatively through the grading process. We don't try and produce a number from it because we would consider that you'd be using really good carbon figures based upon real energy consumption, and you'd be polluting it with estimates and statistics and so on and so on. And I think that would devalue the value of what we're trying to achieve in terms of carbon savings. We produce a certificate. Again, I think Harold said about how scientific we can be. I guess it's a bit boring. It's a graph. It shows how businesses are moving forward. We do have to find a way of maybe making it even more interesting. We use benchmarks, so you can see that in the graph, there's the red layer at the top shows people who are in the poor category. Then orange is fair, green is good, and blue is excellent. And that is businesses working towards going to zero carbon emissions. Now, when we first started our benchmark, we thought, could we ever ask a hotel or a business to be zero carbon? That sounds impossible. But it is possible because many of our businesses are now implementing renewable energy, and they're net producers of renewable energy rather than actually consumers of carbon. And therefore, it is possible to go towards a zero emission. So that is a possibility, and we have some of our businesses that have made these big leaps and reduced their carbon footprint by 80-90% over the last 3 or 4 years, and are already on target with those big objectives for 2050, which is an 80% reduction by then. These are the benchmarks we use. Harold's quite right. You know, it's difficult to produce benchmarks. We need to produce them. We need to provide data that people can understand and compare against their fellow businesses. To produce these benchmarks, you need thousands of businesses, though. You can't do it on 10 businesses or 50 businesses. You have to do it on thousands of businesses. We're lucky because in the UK we have over 1,000 members, so we can compare similar businesses in similar locations and be able to see where they are on this journey. And like I said, we've set ambitious targets for our businesses. We set 1 million tonnes as a goal. When we did that, we didn't know we could do it. And it's thanks to their really great hard work, and there's some super businesses in green tourism who really are totally committed, and I'm going to show you a few examples. I think that anyway gives you the figures on performance. The bottom graph, which shows not CO2 but kilowatt hours, that's a really nice metric and useful metric for comparing the performance of a building. You could do it for your home as your own home if you wanted to. Look at your floor area, look at your kilowatt hours. If you're over 400 kilowatt hours per square metre, you're in the higher category. Some of the older properties obviously have a challenge with getting really low, but some of our best businesses are even able to get down to 200 and even under 100 kilowatt hours per square metre. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of those businesses a bit later. We have an event manager tool. Obviously, I said the elephant in the room is the travel, and therefore we're looking to work with event managers to help them organise events and consider the travel aspect associated with venues and so on. So we've got this as an EVA programme. We're doing that. We're working with the World Land Trust, well-respected organisation UK, who help support rainforest developments, and we've got other partners in Zimbabwe and so on to do social things. This is to finish off a couple of examples. I'll be very quick. This is EICC. Built in the 1990s, quite a green building in certain aspects, but what they've done over the last 5 years, really reduced their carbon footprint, gone from 350 kilowatt hours per square metre down to 200, so that's a really good achievement, and they're able to obviously celebrate that, and obviously associated cost savings as well. This is the Crystal. If you have a chance while you're here in London, I would recommend going on the cable car, the Air Emirates vehicle, because you can do that for free from here anyway. And you go over the Crystal. So you fly over the Crystal, and they have ground source heat pumps, PV panels. They're really low impact. They were built by Siemens. They've got their carbon figures and their kilowatt hour figures down below 100, so they're in the excellent category. And like I say, if you've got a day to visit, go and visit them. They have a visitor attraction there as well, which is a great example, telling us stories about how sustainable cities will be in the future. This is Metropolitan. It's another hotel. They've saved 1,000 tonnes of carbon based upon their bed night performance. Again, have a silver award with us, but really been motoring along on energy savings and so on, and really making a difference. So every business at whatever level are all working hard on that journey. And I guess what we're trying to be is more of a movement than just a certification. We're trying to inspire people. We do need to tell our story better. I'm a bit of a techno guy who knows about carbon and so on, and I do need to work with people who can help to market it. So we've got new marketing people joined us. We hope to be sharing our 20th anniversary story with people over the next year, and we would love you to come and visit our properties and tell us what you think of them as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. Okay. Hello, everyone. I see it very differently. Hi. I see it all rather differently. That's not to say everything that's been said is wrong or I don't agree with it, but I just like to approach it from a different perspective. So I've just made a note here, 4 ways that I'd like to look at carbon. To use its scope to reinforce your business's integrity. It's not just measuring carbon, it's what are you measuring and how can you use it to persuade others to reduce. Streamline your systems so that you can spend quality time doing innovation. Touch everyone with the information. Everybody. It's not just about your business, it's about your customers. Your guests should be going home to reduce their emissions, or your community should be reducing their emissions. This is a problem for us all, we're not islands. And reconfigure through social technology. So, very briefly, we've got 4 sites, 4 cottages, they're fully self-contained. We provide breakfast provisions, the large baths, all the sort of things you might think might be a big problem in terms of trying to reduce your carbon emissions, but we do collect our own water, but we still have to heat the water. We have our own firewood plantation, so some of the firewood we burn is from that and therefore has very low emissions. The site that we measure is that whole land area. That's the 4 cottages, the manager's home and residence, the manager's private car driving, the manager's flight to London to talk to you. All of that is included, as well as the guest cottages, etc. It's not fully Scope 3, it is partly Scope 3. I cannot ask my customers to reduce if I don't, and they want to see what I'm doing. Another point to make here is I'm a tiny business, so we've got to come up with systems that tiny businesses can use because we are the majority, and if we're not going to be changing, we're not going to actually achieve the big changes that we require. So I developed a system called the Green Kangaroo Program. I'll show you in a minute. All our accounts are audited by our accountant who verifies the carbon aspect automatically with no extra cost. And then we use accreditations to help us with best practice. So if you are not in the first world and don't have a computer, this is still quite useful. You might have your accounts on paper and you allocate all the carbon items with coded numbers. Ours is computerized. Every time I purchase petrol or anything, that purchase will go through our financial system and indicating a carbon purchase. No work from me at all. My accountant doesn't charge me for that process. Some of the invoicing that we get from our suppliers will even detail the sources of where their materials are going to on our property. So there it indicates which cottages that gas is going to. So it's simple. And then the carbon calculation is done through a development process by Hatch International, which is a large consultancy company. They charged us $1,000 to do this carbon calculator 10 years ago, which I share with the whole community. The criteria, which obviously, when you are using it, you don't see all those little numbers and data there, but that's just to give you some background that obviously the criteria of how we evaluate electricity and the carbon footprint of electricity in Australia varies by state and by region of state because of where the power plants are. So this is all geared up to be relevant to Kangaroo Valley and what we operate. So our carbon footprint is accurate for where we are. And as Harold says many times, these things need to be customised to local areas or should be considered. So we include septic tanks because obviously our guests' poo should be included too, should it not? Because we have a river system there, we supply water to Sydney, and therefore the quality of our water is important. So we should be monitoring actually that whole process. We include firewood as well. So we actually adjusted it to our local market. I don't know how many regions in the world measure poo. We don't know yet. But that's something to consider. And then we have meters. Now, all of this stuff is about history, isn't it? It's about calculating what you have been generating. So how can I actually improve things to know what we are producing from a carbon footprint point of view by the minute? So we installed meters throughout the business, including firewood on scales. And that allows me to produce data to the record of data at 700,000 times a year. So I know per minute how much a cottage is using from electricity, gas, water and firewood, the inside temperature. I also know all the climate conditions outside every 15 minutes. Why would I want to know that? Because the climate is changing, we are having increasing numbers of extreme weather days. And what we are failing to recognise in all of these discussions is that humans will need to try and keep cool or warm in those extreme conditions. And all the savings that you're making will be plundered when you have 5 or 6 days of extreme hot weather with no cool nights. So you also need to consider and factor into your planning the weather. Anyway, you'll see that the variables that I'm measuring besides carbon help me to plot where we could be going as a business in terms of innovation to help to reduce that footprint. And briefly, touching everybody, that means the community, who won highly commended 10 years ago, and so everybody was involved in celebrating that fact, so we get everybody on board. We talk to schools, even young primary schools, but we don't talk carbon, we use another method to communicate about the importance of the environment. We've been on national and international TV with a population of 340. So it shows you that this sort of thing, there's lots of airtime and opportunities for it. Online, we communicate. If you go onto our website, crystalcreekmeadows.com.au, you will find that green information is spread throughout, upfront, clear. I don't know whether I use the word sustainability. How does that mean 1 or 2 minutes? 1 minute. I've got my glasses on. So we also developed a product called My Green Butler, which helps guests reduce. Completely contrary to the previous work, which I'm not saying is wrong, but I've reversed it by giving lots of detail to guests in their cottages, which they love. How do I know they love it? It's the most used manual in the cottage, not where the pub is, not where the walk is, because we have to change the folder regularly because everybody reads it. Because lots of men and women are now having to do this in their jobs, and they like it. And then we have interpersonal communication where we talk about carbon, we talk about reduction, and people join in. And then we give them eco-feedback and a carbon footprint, which we correlate to driving distance. So an average couple staying 2 nights will use the same amount of carbon as driving 20 kilometres. The end.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Harold, for inviting UNWTO to participate in this session. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the presence of the Minister of Tourism of Madagascar here, Mr. Roland Ratsaraka. It's a pleasure to have you here with us, sir. And Harold, I would like to say that it really is a clear indication of the commitment of Madagascar to move on the sustainability of the tourism policy and specifically specific interest in carbon emission reductions. Thank you very much, Minister, to be here with us. Let me see if I get it right. Yes. Just for those of you that do not follow up these figures very frequently, but last year we have overcome the landmark of 1.2 billion international tourism arrivals. This year, as it goes until this moment, until September, we just issued our latest figures. We are very close to reaching 1.3 billion international arrivals this year. But let's not forget that besides international tourism, domestic tourism is very, very important, and on the economic side, but also on the CO2 emissions. So when there is emission in tourism, whether it's domestic or international, there are no borders in the atmosphere, as you were mentioning, Harold, in the beginning. So it all matters. You may have heard again and again, many times, that our sector is responsible for 5% of CO2 emissions overall. That's where the calculations come from. It's our publication with UNEP back in 2008, and having a baseline of having a reference year of 2005, altogether 4.95% of total CO2 emissions, considering all the whole world in all different activities. Air transport is 40% of that, so it means that 2 percentage points of the 5% mark. But more important than having that figure is that it's been updated now. We are working with International Transport Forum of OECD, and with the update that only for the transport part, not for everything, but only for the transport and for air transport at this point, we want to also issue some policy guidelines. It's not just saying that, well, tourism is responsible for so many points, or air transport is responsible for such a percentage, but also transport policies. What are the transport policies for international tourism, for regional and sub-regional transport policies and guidance? What can we suggest, advise in that regard? And we also want to model an optimization of CO2 emissions in point-to-point travel. So now I skip all the climate challenge and why climate change is important for tourism. But let's remember that in the Paris Climate Change Agreement, the adaptive capacities and the strengthening of climate change resilience became a global goal, and adaptation is given the same priority as mitigation. It's there in SDG 13. As you know, SDG 13 is about climate action, and this statement is there very clearly. From our perspective, from UNWTO, these are some of the initiatives I'm going to mention to you in the following slides. The first one is measuring sustainable tourism. We have just launched this initiative after a couple of years of work, and it's about developing a framework for measuring sustainable tourism based in the economic, environmental accounting system as devised by the UN, by the United Nations. So there is an economic, environmental accounting system overall approved for all countries. Now what we are doing is to develop the model for our sector so that in the future we can, all countries can measure our environmental, let's say, impact, and in line with other sectors in the world. And it's also in line with our tourism satellite account, which is the model, which is the framework for measuring the economic impact of tourism. So as UNWTO is the custodian for the measurement of indicators 8.9, there are 2 indicators there, and SDG 12B. So this is the basic framework that we are going to use to develop those indicators, and we expect to have the whole framework ready by 2020. 2020, the whole framework ready by 2020, in 3 years' time. No, we will not be able to measure as we would like to, because the indicators have just been created. We did not know what was coming to. Now that the indicators have been established, now we are developing the framework so that we can start measuring by 2020. Because SDGs are up to 2030, okay? The other initiative that we have, and this is more at the destination level, is the network of sustainable tourism observatories. The indicators there are based in a publication that we have from 2005. There are 9 mandatory issue areas for these observatories to measure, and 4 of them have to do with our discussions here: energy management, water management, waste water management, and solid waste management. So observatories are in China, in São Paulo, Brazil, in Guanajuato, Mexico, 2 in the US, 1 in New Zealand, and a number in Indonesia, Croatia, and Greece. Of course, these are very different destinations. Each one have their own interests there, but in order to be able to benchmark one against the other, we have these 9 mandatory issue areas for them to measure. There are indicators related to each one of these areas, and these observatories do not belong to UNWTO, but we support them methodologically. And every year there is a meeting. The next one will be December next month at UNWTO, and it's open to other observatories as well that are not part of our network. They are welcome to participate and to see and discuss what they are doing with others. Another very important initiative regarding to our discussions here is the 10-year framework of programs. As you may know, this is SDG 12. These programs were created by the Rio Plus 20 conference in 2012 for 6, at that moment, 5 different areas, including sustainable tourism. So UNWTO was requested to lead, and we have as co-leads France, Morocco, and the Republic of Korea. And the idea is to develop policies and also present cases and stimulate basically to stimulate decoupling tourism growth from the consumption of natural resources. And that is the key issue for us. We are working on this. There are some 130 different organizations working with us. And we already have more than 100, and there are 135 cases in 50 different countries. So this is our latest annual magazine that you'll find also online. And I would stimulate it to go into it and eventually become one of the partners of the initiative. there is a very interesting one. I would stimulate you to look into the case of Morocco. They are developing what they call a nationally appropriate mitigation action. They are starting with Marrakesh, but they intend to do it throughout the country. They have measured the CO2 emissions generated by the international arrivals, by the accommodation, by local transport, etc. And now they are applying measures to reduce it. And at UNWTO, we have developed 2 projects with European funds, especially targeted to small hotels, family hotels around Europe with European standards. And these are to mitigate, to reduce the use of energy and provide the, let's say, even the economic calculation for investment that hotels eventually would like to do in order to substitute their present energy sources. As you know, we are in the International Year of Sustainable Tourism for Development, and we have 5 key areas for developing our activities. There you have in red the 3rd one, which is resource efficiency, environmental protection, and climate change. We have related those areas with the corresponding SDGs. And we have two research documents to be finalized soon, addressing these different areas and the SDGs. When we have collected a number of case studies from around the world. It's very interesting to see what people have done, are doing already, whether it's different companies like we've seen the examples here, or government policies. And to finalize, Harold, we at UNWTO, we are doing our homework in terms of our activities on carbon offsetting. We are calculating every year. We have come to a point that we find it extremely difficult to reduce, given the building that we have. It's a building that was constructed in the 70s, in the late 70s. So it's very, very inefficient. So what we have not been able to reduce since last year, we are buying credits to offset through projects that are offered by UN Environment. So we consider all the travel that we do, all the activities in the building, outside the building, and in our statutory meetings, like General Assembly, Executive Council meetings, we are now offering our hosts to offset the CO2 emissions, providing them with reference for calculating them. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed.
Can I thank the panel on your behalf? It's been a fascinating, to some extent, it's raised my hopes. But I think still the problem of how we address carbon and get more people into the room to hear about it. It's very good to see a minister here. It's a very rare occurrence to see a minister at a panel about carbon change. But it is the area where we need to make the most progress fast. I should be long dead, or at least a short time dead, before it becomes a major problem for people. But it's already clear that the carbon agenda is knocking on the door, and we're not making progress anything like fast enough. No, we're closed. Thanks very much for coming.